Hello, welcome back to my channel. For those of you who don't know, my name is Danny. I am a student at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And today I'll be discussing Jim Crow and racial segregation in airports from the mid-20th century. The Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938 prohibited all airlines from discriminating against passengers by race. The airlines actually followed this without any question or protest. So everything's good, right? Wrong. 3 years later, in 1941, National Airport, actually right here in Washington, D.C., opened up. When it opened, everything was segregation-free, but that quickly changed. Some restaurants started to discriminate and segregate against black passengers, denying them service, saying they had to be in a separate area than white people. They said that under Section 1796A of the Virginia Code, which mandated segregation in all public facilities, that this was the way it had to be. It had to be segregated. So a lot of black passengers, when they would come in through Washington National Airport, they couldn't get food. They'd have to go hungry in the airport. That's crazy. In fact, until 1947, African Americans couldn't even get a meal at National. It wasn't until Air Terminal Services created a separate cafeteria for them that they could. And this cafeteria was in the basement. It was dirty, it was cramped, it was dark. Just a terrible, terrible insult to anybody. In 1947, retired school teacher Helen Nash was shown this cafeteria for food, and she was appalled. She then filed a lawsuit against Air Terminal Services, saying that her service was completely inadequate, and ultimately the all-white jury disagreed. They didn't think that having to eat in a basement cafeteria while other white passengers could eat in restaurants, they didn't think that was inadequate somehow. Thankfully though, this didn't last too long. On December 27th, 1948, Civil Aeronautics Administrator Delos Renzel ordered that National had to integrate all of its facilities. Former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt actually praised him. 8 days later, on January 4th, 1949, this ruling went into effect, and then the next day, January 5th, 1949, civil rights activists who had previously experienced discrimination at some of their restaurants went to those restaurants and found they still were experiencing preferential service towards white people. They would have to wait a couple hours to be served. Staff were friendlier to white passengers. But after January 5th, there's no other documentation of any kind of discrimination at the restaurants, and it seems afterwards, racial discrimination departed DCA. But at the same time, in May 1948, in Atlanta, Georgia, a restaurant opened up called Dobbs House. This restaurant was immediately segregated right off the bat, opening day. What made this restaurant unique, however, was that its waitstaff were almost entirely black. When passengers would come up to the entrance, there'd be a black man at the door portraying Uncle Remus. Uncle Remus is a fictional character in books written by Joel Chandler Harris, who documented stories in post-Reconstruction South. Uncle Remus was this simple-minded, jolly black sharecropper. He would tell proverbial stories about animals and nature with really no ostensible regard to freedoms or his lack thereof. There's a Disney film, Song of the South, which features prominently Uncle Remus. It's probably one of the most infamous Disney films of all time. Anyways, we've got a black man at the door, black servers serving white people. Very reminiscent of the South before and after Reconstruction, during slavery, during sharecropping. It was eerie. Dobbs House horrified civil rights activists more than experiencing racial discrimination from white baristas and coffee shop workers did, because this was a case of black people refusing to serve black people. They were being discriminated against by the very people they were fighting for. Brethren, the people you expected to fight for you like you're fighting for them. When black passengers would come to the restaurant, they would either be turned away or they would be shown a back corner of the room, dimly lit, curtained off. They wouldn't get service for hours. They'd have to just sit there and starve. Delta Airlines was aware of the racial discrimination that was happening in the South, and to try to combat that, they would, one, reimburse any passenger who claimed that they experienced racial discrimination in transportation to and from the airport, such as paying extra expenses for limousine service that weren't incurred onto white passengers. Delta would also provide meal vouchers for black passengers. When they would present their Dobbs House meal vouchers, the Dobbs House staff would say, sorry, we're not serving you, or we're not seating you here. It was outrageous. Delta Airlines was on the right side of history, but at this time, unfortunately, black passengers would often have to starve if they didn't bring their own food. In 1958, a gentleman named H.D. Koch filed a lawsuit against the restaurant. It was Koch v. Atlanta. This time, he actually won. On January 20th, 1960, Judge William Boyd Sloan ordered that the city of Atlanta, the entire airport, and all of its facilities and restaurants had to integrate. They could not do segregation. He found it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Shortly thereafter, a news crew filmed the restaurant and the airport. Everything appeared to be fine. There were no reports of any resistance, any refusal of service to anybody after the 1960 ruling. In the Deep South, such as in Montgomery, Birmingham, really in Alabama, Alabama and Texas a lot, there was still a lot of segregation. In 1961, while the freedom rides were happening on buses down south, there were freedom flyers, and they would conduct fly-ins where they would sit at restaurant counters in airports and refuse to leave until they could get service. Ultimately, it was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that finally forced all airport facilities to integrate. Following this integration, there haven't been any notable cases of racial discrimination in airport facilities. There isn't a lot of information about segregation and Jim Crow in airport terminals. A lot of the information that I've provided in this video come from a book called Jim Crow Terminals by Anke Ortlepp. I believe that's how you pronounce her name. We still have a lot to uncover about the history of Jim Crow, segregation, race relations in airports. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. I wish you luck in your studies and happy holidays. I'll see you later. Bye!